Stuff ready?
Hello, hi. La 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 la. Vamos vamos a cantar todos. Okay. Thank you so much to each and every one of you for being here. I really appreciate this a lot because there are so many options today that really, I mean, it's a privilege that you decided to, be here. I'm gonna start with the presentation, and then we're gonna do a question and answer with Dr. Vaughan for 15-20 minutes, and then we're gonna open to question and answers with everybody else. All right? So let's do this. Okay. So, who am I? For those of you who don't know me, I am Eva Silot Bravo, Dr. Eva Silot Bravo, and I'm an Afro-Cuban female educator, author, interdisciplinary scholar, creative and former diplomat and international negotiator in United Nations, New York. I am the current ethnic studies teacher at Oakland School for the Arts in Oakland. I have one book already published, which is the one that brought us here. I also have more than 20 articles, art reviews, and interviews published. I have currently 2 book projects, and one of them is a novel, and my topics of choice are Cuban music, literature, film. It used to be Miami alternative culture, migrant, female, and Afro-descendant voices, that's current, and African diaspora, that's across the board. I have a blog, which is called Blog Cubanidad in Between. And I also created 2 bilingual podcasts, Miami Alternativo and World Culture. I also produced concerts and collaborated with local cultural institutions in Miami, promoting Cuban alternative music and the arts. Can you hear me fine? Thank you. So, a book overview. What is my book about? Or what do I think my book is about? Because everybody has their own interpretation. Well, with my book, I encourage a multidisciplinary conversation about the sustained process of transnationalization of Cuban cultural production since the turn of the 21st century. I also document a relatively unexplored transnational network of collaborations among Cuban musicians, singers, songwriters, and jazzis that migrated to Miami, New York, Madrid, and other world cities from the 90s forward. I document important developments in the Cuban jazz and fusion scenes outside the island in the last 20 plus years. And for me, ultimately, the book is a way to pay tribute to diverse ways of the music legacy of the African diaspora has manifested in Cuban culture, its music and musicians across the globe. What was my motivation for writing this book? Well, first of all, it's a profound love and passion for my culture and Cuban music.
Can you have a round of applause for Ella?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Also, the fact that Cuba is among the 5 most important Latinx migrant groups in the U.S., Cubans, and when I started writing this book, I didn't see a lot of research beyond Cold War narratives or mainstream music markets. In some cases, there were some research on hip hop and also, some Afro-Cuban topics, but for the most part, when I started writing this book, everything was kind of like perpetuating this idea of that everything that was valuable in Cuban music or Cuban culture was from the 50s. And I see that a lot, so I wanted to go beyond that because Cuban culture is an ongoing process, and that it's not only political, as a lot of people believe, even though politics has a strong influence in our lives, of course. That is why we are there. We have so many Cuban migrants all over. But I personally saw that there was a lot going on in terms of music development that was not documented, especially after the 90s, when we had this important crisis, and we have a global community of migrants all over the world. Also, I wanted to infuse Cuban music studies with post-colonial and cultural studies lens, which I didn't see a lot in the publications or in the literature that I was researching and reading. I also particularly want to debunk stereotypes and polarized perspectives about Cuban culture beyond mainstream music markets and cold war narratives, right? And I wanted to read an intro passage. I forgot to bring my book. You all have it. I think I have it. I want to read this. Well, anyways, I cannot find it, so okay. So I have my bookmark, but you know how it is when you're a little bit nervous. So also I wanted to, highlight the fact that there was an important crisis in the 90s after the Berlin Wall fall, and as a result of that crisis, there was a significant relocation of Cuban musicians across the world, and as a result of that, there's a Cuban, what we can see today as a Cuban global music diaspora. I have never seen in the history of Cuba a phenomenon in which there's so many Cuban musicians all over the world. I know that there always have been, Cuban migrants all over, but like since the 90s on, there are Cuban scenes in many different cities across the world. I've never seen something like this, so I think we are living in a historic moment that has implications for our culture, for music, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So, this is a kind of historic commentary about Cuban music in diaspora. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just want to highlight some moments that I think are important in the history of Cuban music in diaspora. First of all, when the migration of Afro-Cubans happened to New Orleans after the abolition of slavery in Cuba in 1886, and they are in the literature, I see that there's a recognition of why Americans adopting Cuban music patterns like Luis Moreau Gostad, I don't know how to pronounce that, Gostad. And as a result of that, people recognize the Spanish theme, right? And because they see that the cinquillo and habanera was adopted in the jazz made in New Orleans, right? So this is, I think, the first example of the influence of Afro-Cubans or Cubans in the US culture and music. But I think a lot more research needs to be done in regards to this topic, which is fascinating. Also, I know that in the 19th century, there is a recognition of what people call Cuban nationalists, which were a lot of Cuban musicians who were adopting in the dance, in the dance scenes, right? Like contradanza, etc. They were adopting Afro-Cuban patterns in the music, so they are recognized as Cuban nationalists, and a lot of them were outside Cuba or were traveling constantly outside Cuba, so I in a way recognize them as kind of migrants, and they were in Europe, New York, and Latin America, like Brindis de Salas, Ignacio Cervantes, José Guay, Manuel Pérez, Hubert de Blanc. This list, as you can see, when we talk about Cuban music, a lot is men, but there's not much written about women. I'm sure that there are a lot of women that were part of these movements that we need still to know what they were doing, but that's the way history usually is written. And I'm also guilty of that because, if you see my book, there's a lot of men musicians, and I really would like to open research and discussions about what is the role of more Cuban women and other, LGBTQ, etc., in the history of music. So in the 20s, 30s, there was this cabarets and big bands, right, moment, and there were a lot of musicians who were very famous, Cuban musicians across the world, bringing our culture, to other lands like Rita Montaner, Eliseo Granel, Chiquita Serrano, Moisés Simón with, El Manicero, Don Aspiazo, Antonio Machín, Ernesto Lecuona, etc. Then in the 40s, we have this important moment of the Afro-Cuban jazz, right, when that emerged in New York as a result of the interaction of Cubans who were living there, like Chano Pozo, Mario Bauza, etc., with Dizzy Gillespie, etc. And in the 50s, we have the mambo craze, in which a lot of Cuban music was adopted, but in the Hollywood style, right? And then we have other musicians who were also protagonists of this, like Arsenio Rodriguez, Tito Puentes, De Cachaos, Tito Rodriguez, etc. So in the 60s, 70s, as a result of the revolution, a lot of musicians migrated because for many different reasons, but some of them didn't have a job, or they were not in agreement with what was going on in the island. We have the case of Celia Cruz, La Sonora Matancera, La Lupe, Bebo Valdez, Olga Guillot, and the interesting thing about these musicians that they were almost unknown for many Cubans in the island throughout a lot of years. So I don't remember listening anything about Celia Cruz while living in the island, and I get familiar with her in the 90s when I started traveling to New York as a diplomat. And that's a shame because Celia Cruz is an icon of our culture and is an important, female Afro-Cuban representative of our culture, so we didn't know anything about her for years because of political, situations and the way the government operates when it comes to a lot of Cuban migrants that disappear from documentations. Now, recently, big things are starting to change, so we have an important, musicologist, her name is Rosa Marchetti. She just published a book about Celia Cruz. And, things are changing in that sense, but I don't think she's even in Cuba, I think she's in Spain. So we have, of course, what we hear here a lot, especially in the Bay Area, about the embargo and under embargo, influence in the exchange of materials, cultural materials between Cuba and the US that happened since 1962. And I put it here because it's an important, element in the way Cuba is known or non-known in the US. In the 70s, 80s, we have the phenomenon of Miami Sound Machine, as many of you know, right? Gloria and Emilio Estefan and Willie Chirino became really icons of Cuban culture in their own ways, in their Americanized ways. And in the 80s, we have, the Mariel Bowley wave, and then we have Paquito de Rivera, Ignacio Berroa, Albita Rodriguez, Jorge Luis Piloto, etc. Now, there's an interesting element that I found out that I have not heard about, which is that in 1988, there was an amendment to the regulations of the Cuban embargo, and it's called the Berman Amendment. And through this amendment, it reinstates the exchange of circulation of Cuban cultural materials in the US, including recordings and live music for educational and cultural purposes. So that means that even though the embargo is in place, there are some regulations that allow the hiring of Cuban musicians, the circulation of information between the island and Cuba, and I don't hear that a lot emphasized when we talk about Cuban culture music. And in the 90s, in the case of the music diaspora, that's where my book focused on. There was, as I said, a massive global Cuban migration to Miami, New York, the West Coast, Madrid, Canada, Paris, Latin America, of singer-songwriters, Cuban jazz, academically trained musicians, hip-hoppers. We have here one of the representatives, Las Crudas. We have, one of the pioneers of the hip-hop movement in the island, who also had to migrate at a certain point. And we also have the timba and rock scenes, right? All sorts of musicians migrated all over the place because we didn't really have a choice. And when I say we, I include myself, but even though I was in a different route, I feel part of them. So since then, a lot of researchers talk about the 2000s, the Cubaton, right? It was an explosion of Cubaton. And the interesting thing with Cubaton is that for the first time, a radio station in Miami was created that only promotes Cubaton, reggaeton, which is the Cuban version of reggaeton. That never happened before. So reggaeton, in a way, opened up routes for Cuban music made in the island or outside the island that has never been there before. So it was really interesting to me, but I don't really engage too much in that because there are other researchers that have, published literature about it. And now, more recently, since the 2010s, we have what we call reparto, what some people call reparto, which is, in other ways, it's other ways to talk about what Afro-Cubans are producing, right? We are very funny to talk about different ways in which Cuban music and Afro-Cuban music is regarded. So, in the case that I focus my book, which is Cuban music from the 90s, the elements that I focus on are the art school's legacy. As a result of the revolution, there was an amazing system of schools of the arts across the country that graduated a lot of musicians with an extremely and rigorous education. So that promoted a lot of musicianship, and I'm very interested in what these musicians have been doing after that, graduation and in the world with this background of very classist emphasis, because I don't know if you know, I studied this system of music when we were little. Cuban popular music was prohibited. If we were caught in this school of music playing Cuban music, we were in trouble. So because it was this extremist, because we're very extremist in Cuba, especially the government, but when it comes to culture, we all of a sudden wanted everybody to be classical musicians, European style, and we didn't want to engage even with our own legacy, even though Cuban music is so important in Cuba. That has changed, but that was a moment of interest, also another moment of interest in our, history. So there's also the legacy of Cuban jazz. I call it Cuban jazz. Some people, don't like that, but I think there's a Cuban jazz because it has been happening since, the moment the Afro-Cuban jazz emerged, and even before in the 20s with the big bands that were in cabarets in Cuba everywhere. And we have a tradition of jazz. We have always tried to dialogue with jazz in our own ways in the island, and we have created what I call Cuban jazz, which is, we will see some examples later on, musically speaking. So at that moment in the 90s, there was also a renaissance of Afro-Cuban religions and cultural practices as a result of the crisis, and that had an effect on the music that was made in the island and outside the island with the migrants. Also, which is something that we have always done, I think, as an island, we always have been, because we have been isolated for so long, there's a particular curiosity to engage with the world in different ways, right? So we have always had extreme influence of American music, Afro-American music in Cuba, and musicians have always dialogued with all kinds of, music from outside the island, like Afro-Cuban music, funk, rap, hip hop, R&B, and also with Spanish rock and with Brazilian music. This generation in the 90s has a strong, curiosity to engage with this other music. So other phenomena that had to do or influence this music scene has to do with the dollarization of the economy. Why? Because since the 90s on, the economy in Cuba became a tourist oriented economy, and that had several implications for the music and the culture that was created in the island and outside the island. All of a sudden we were back to Buena Vista Social Club phenomenon, right? That in a way, it was beautiful for Cuban culture because it put us back in the map, but the way it put us back in the map was like coming back to the 50s aesthetics and forgetting about everything else that happened afterwards. So it was very interesting for us to see that what was valuable for Cuban culture was the 50s, not anything else afterwards. And then also there was a disenchantment, a discontent, and an apathy with the revolutionary project since the 90s on, because as you know, many people were really starving. There was nothing going on. So after the Soviet Union remove their subsidy of the economy, which was the 80% of the economy, we were like, so what is the revolution about? What is the socialist economy about? Because we didn't have transportation, food, anything. That is why the tourist economy emerged, creating a lot of divisions, a lot of hierarchies, which are still present today. So as I say already, there's an ongoing and unprecedented migration of Cuban creatives and musicians. And there are transnational Cuban music scenes. When I refer to transnational, I refer to musicians that are in constant movement. They are not even though they are migrants, they have contacts with the island, they come back and forth, but they have contacts with other cities. So they are producing music that they call Cuban outside the territory of the island. They are producing music using the internet or using the mobility that they have acquired as migrants. So they are like spaces of circulation of culture, Cuban culture, outside the island. And that is what I call transnational. So I focus on singer-songwriters in Madrid, Latin America, Miami, reggaeton, reggaeton repertoire, I don't focus on that. I don't know why it's here, but anyway, let's go. So I'm gonna give you some examples of what I'm referring to in this book. The first one, I refer to singer-songwriters. In the case of Yusa, she's a Cuban musician who is now in New Orleans based. She is this combination of singer-songwriter, academically trained musician, incredible musician. She's a multi-instrumentalist. She's a composer, and she is really out of this world when it comes to music. And she's queer as well. She's also queer, yes, it's very important. Yeah, to highlight this, because even though some of the musicians don't even engage in expressing their gender, because you know how we Cubans are, right? We are very patriarchal, so we don't talk about gender that much. But I guess in the world we are more in tune with who we are. We have spaces to explore who we are more. And now in Cuba as well, and since the 90s, I think more people are doing that. But these musicians are pushing genetic boundaries, right? They're not interested in being labeled as Cuban music. They are fusionizing, and that is why I call my book Cuban Fusion. They're fusionizing Cuban music, traditional and modern, with all kind of influence, and you will see that. They have what I call an open-ended and eclectic fusion of Afro-Cuban music with world sonorities. And I guess particularly, I see in them a need to explore beyond traditional and popular Cuban music genres, right? They have an intense need to go beyond what people think is Cuban, right? And they are in constant dialogue with the world. So you will see, this is a recording of Yusa in Argentina. She used to live there for a while. I don't have the, Cory, where's Cory? Cory, I cannot, oh yeah, I can see now. Sorry about that. How can I open this? Okay, So you can see this is an example of how they are reinterpreting La Nueva Trova legacy further, right? And Novísima Trova. So they're opening up Cuban songs to all kinds of world influence. Right? So now we have also an example of Cuban jazz scenes. There's a renaissance of Cuban musicianship across the world. I see that since the 90s on. And there's a proliferation of local and international jazz scenes and increasingly recognized Cuban jazzes, Afro-Cuban and timba scenes and collaborative projects in places like New York, Spain, New Orleans, Europe, and the West Coast and Florida. And I call that a postmodern recreation of the cultural legacy of the African diaspora, West African chants, rhythms, instruments in Cuban music and jazz production across borders. So you have Pedrito Martinez, you have Omar Sosa, you have Ivan Melon Lewis, and many others. So this is an example of one of these musicians. This is Ivan Melon Lewis. He has different formats, quintets, he has even big bands, and this is in the 20s. This is a concert that he did with Roman Filiu, Ariel Bringues, Renier El Negrón, and Luc Mil Perez, all Cuban musicians based in Europe. So you will see what I'm referring to when Okay, so this is common. It's happening everywhere around the world, in which Cuban musicians are gathering and then creating jazz scenes. And they are not only interacting among themselves, they are really influencing the places where they are living or the places where they reside. So you can see influence of Cuban jazz in Madrid, in New York, in Miami, in other places across the world. Oops. So let's go to the next one. I don't know how to move from here. Yeah, but I can. Okay. So no, I went back. Okay, another example, and I'm gonna end soon. I only have 2 more slides. I always hear here, oh my God, there's so many problems with Cuban musicians. We cannot bring them. We cannot whatever. But let me tell you, I probably am positive. I always try to see the positive and look for the positive everywhere. And nowadays, there are collaborations that are happening between musicians from the island and outside the island. And this is an example. Timba Live is an incredible timba band based in Miami. And this is a video of a song that they made in Miami, in which they went to Cuba and they collaborated with Osain Del Monte. Please, you have to listen to Osain Del Monte. They are like rumberos, high quality, like incredible, defending our culture. And they did this collaboration. They went to Havana, filmed there, and then they filmed the other part of the video in Miami. But it's a beautiful, I think, example of the collaborations that are happening and taking place between musicians from the island and outside the island. That is unparalleled because, as you know, because of the political environment and the bilateral situation for years, there were not many collaborations going on, and people were complaining a lot about that. So this is going on, this is happening, because I think another thing that I highlight in my research is that musicians have been paving the way for the encounters, the cultural encounters that other people envision. So Cuban musicians have always paved the way in collaborations, through interactions, trying to overcome all sorts of political obstacles that they have faced because of the bilateral situation between the two countries. So this is an example. What I say here is that, yeah, well, what I just said, in other words. So let's listen to this. I love this. You can dance. And then you have also Mayito Rivera. You have seen Mayito Rivera here. He's a former Bamban member. You know, we are all Bamban fans, I think, here. Anybody's not a Bamban fan? So, Bamban is one of the most popular, probably is the most popular, you know, Cuban music band that existed since the 60s on, right? And then, yeah. And then lastly, but not less important, this is another transnational example of, you know, collaborations between Cuban musicians from the island and outside the island. This time it's about political issues because I don't know if you're aware, but in July 11, 2021, there was a massive protest in Cuba because of the conditions, unbearable conditions of living for the majority of people, especially for, you know, Afro-Cubans, etc. And then these musicians did what they call Patria y Vida. This song, who got a Grammy, a Latin Grammy, subvert the officialist nationalist slogan Patria y Muerte with Patria y Vida. Cuban artists from both shores made viral updated coordinates for imagining alternative and solidarity narratives of Cubanness, crystallizing the increasing hopes and calls for a free Cuba within the island and across the globe, especially since the massive protests on July 2021. Some of the musicians that, one of them, I think he's still in jail in Cuba, Michael Osorbo, is an Afro-Cuban artist who's still just for protesting, okay? For what a lot of people do here. And I know some people are very strange when some people get in jail because of protesting. We Cubans are very familiar with that because protest is not legal in our land. So these people, you know, express their feelings about that, and I think it's very important, another transnational moment. Can we have more volume? Thank you. A little bit.
Porque con tu voz se van mis penas. Y este sentimiento ya es tan viejo. Tú me dueles tanto aunque estés lejos. Hoy te invito a caminar en el solar para demostrar que sí, ver tus ideales. Somos humanos aunque no pensemos iguales. No tratemos ni dañemos como animales. Esta es mi forma de decírtelo. Llora mi pueblo, siento yo su voz. 59, yo doble 2, 60 años, trancada al dominó. Mambo y platillo a los 500 de La Habana. Mientras en casa las cazuelas ya no tienen jama. Que celebramos si la gente anda deprisa. Cambiando Che Guevara, llama al tipo la divisa. Todo ha cambiado, que no es lo mismo. Entre tú y yo hay un abismo. Publicidad, un paraíso, un varadero. Mientras las madres lloran por sus hijos que se fueron. Tu 59, yo doble 2. 60 años, trancando mi nombre. Se acabó. Ya se acabó. 60 años, trancando mi nombre. Somos artistas, somos sensibilidad. La historia verdadera no la va a contar. Somos vida de un pueblo entero pisoteado.
Okay, thank you so much. This is my presentation. And I'm very thankful that you are here and that you listen to me the whole time. Now we're going to have fun. We're going to invite Dr. Vaughan for a session of discussions. Let me introduce properly. Can you present yourself? Introduce yourself. I know you're a doctor. I know you have published a lot, and he has dealt with Afro-Cuban music in particular. So my whole respect.
What's up, everybody? How everybody doing? Everybody good?
Hey, doing good.
Let's give another round of applause to everybody.
Thank you.
Did everyone buy the book yet?
Yes.
Okay, good. One of the things that has been heavy on my mind is, in American culture and world culture, the practice of buying books and dealing with ideas more than what's on TV or the internet is being lost. So I want to appreciate all of you guys for being here and for digging into these ideas that are complex. They're not easy always, right? There's some pain in it. There's joy, there's all kind of emotions and experiences, and I'm glad that you guys are willing to take the journey with Eva and with me, right? And thank you again, Eva, for inviting me to be with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I wrote so far 2 books about Cuba, and I grew up in Oakland, but I could almost say that I became a man in Havana. Come on. I met Las Crudas when they were on stilts in old Havana, and I was trying to figure out who I was walking around in there, right? And during that time, I spent, many hours researching in the Center for the Development of Cuban Music at Silot, who was directed by a guy named Olavo Allen. You probably know Olavo. And there was another researcher there named Raimundo Villarrutia. And one time we were talking about soul and talking about just the spirit of Cuban music. And 2 men, he was like, "You about to dance with me song right now." And so we dancing song in his office. And he said, come on. And he says, "Para tener sabor, if you're gonna be funky, you gotta be unpredictable. Tiene que ser impredecible." And that kind of stuck with me always in terms of navigating Cuban music and what it means to be a musician and artist, emoting and creating from the base of Cuba. And I wrote a book about Carlos Aldama and Bata music, Bata drumming, etc. And it always tripped me out about Carlos that, it's like, "Carlos, you like baseball?" Like, hell no, I don't like baseball. I'm into NASCAR. Impredecible, unpredictable. Or I would be in the house of Cusito, one of the master actores of Cuba, one of the master rumberos from Rumberos de Cuba, etc. What was Cusito listening to in his house? He was not listening to Los Bambas, he was not listening to Muñequitos Matanzas, he was listening to hip-hop. Mm-hmm. Boom. So this idea of being unpredictable and, your center, your root, your feeding to whatever your creation is, being something that, el mundo quizás no calcule. People might not calculate, right? I wanted to respond to another thing that was mentioned, this African-American and Cuban connection that you mentioned of people migrating from Cuba to New Orleans. I have a Cuban connection that's mentioned in Sterling Stuckey's book, right? He talks about a place in Louisiana called Point Capit. This is just north of Baton Rouge. Before Louisiana was a French colony, it belonged to Spain. And in that area, there was a lot of slave rebellions. And my family in Point Capit was among those Negros Bravos. And Spain would send its police force from Havana to Point Capit to quell the rebellions, and then also send people who was acting up to Havana to go to jail. So I had this connection of mulatto families from Puerto Rico with last names like Aguilar and Aguila. This connection of, Cuban, African American, which like is the basis for this musical connection that we have. So I really appreciate you for recognizing that. Reading the book, I was really fascinated by this idea of in-between spaces that you have. While I was, writing books about bata drumming, this Yoruba-derived tradition, while I was writing a book about timba music, this, legado of rumba, con son, con jazz, always in my peripheral vision were these other musical traditions and scenes that were happening in Havana, in Matanzas, in Santiago. There was pastilla y moña, like, the people in Havana was doing that whole thing. Or also people who were rockers, people who were, engaging in alternative musical scenes. And so this focus of yours on what's happening in this alternative space is really beautiful. And I hope that, you can find ways to kind of grow that and kind of trace it from the 90s and 2000s into the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Some of the questions that come up for me, for you as a researcher, are who are now that you're a resident here in the Bay Area, who are some of the musicians that represent that between space here in Oakland? One that comes to mind for me is Jesus Diaz y su Cuba, su Cuba, right? Anybody know Jesus Diaz? Run over to Jesus Diaz, kind of. Started with the ingenious name of QBA, which in Spanish is Cuba, right? Or in English, Cuba, right? And the music that he plays, because of his long time here, because of his rootedness in this place, he's able to express tumbaos and a totally Cuban idea with a certain lean that is so authentically and sweetly Oakland that you just gotta be like, damn, Jesus, come on, it's beautiful. And so, as a first question, I wonder if you could mention some musical experiences or some particular musicians that you have encountered here in Oakland that exist in that in-between space that you're cultivating.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I moved to the Bay Area 3 years ago, and I really haven't been very familiar with Cuban music here. I spent quite some time studying and experiencing Cuban music in Miami, in New York, in Madrid, but I haven't really had the chance to experience music here, so I don't really talk about it that much here. I only know a lot about jazzes. So I talk about Omar Sosa in my book. I talk about Jimmy Brantley, people who are in LA, because I'm more interested in that. But my idea of in between is not my own idea. That comes from post-colonial author, his name is Homi Bhabha, and he talks about that in the modern representations of society, we're so used to talk about binary representations, the left or the right, especially when we talk about nations, when we talk about national subjects, we left behind a lot of people who don't fit into what we consider national subjects, which are dissidents, subaltern subjects of all kinds, LGBTQs, Afro-descendants, etc. So when I bring this idea of Homi Bhabha to my book, it's a way to recognize that there's a space that is not that much talked about, in which the majority of people are. Because it's normal, I guess in a way, because we're so used to binary representation of every reality that we only talk about people who do this or do that. When it comes to cultures, the Cuban culture, we talk about stereotypical ways of looking at Cuba, from these traditional ways of looking at Cuba, or from the Cold War narratives in which Cubans are either victims or warriors. But between those representations, there's a lot of other realities, and I wanted to give a space, recognizing that there's an in-between space in which a lot of people are producing music, producing culture, and this, I'm very happy that you bring this example of Jesus Diaz. I guess there are many other musicians and cultural producers that are in these in-between spaces that they're not that recognized, because in literature we are not used to recognize a lot of people who are not that visible according to these parameters, binary parameters. So I just want to give a space when I recognize that there's an in-between space to all these other voices that I think are really important to highlight in our culture, within and outside the island. So I just didn't want, I didn't want to wait for people to be dead in order to start talking about them. I want to talk about them while they are alive. So I'm very glad that Jesus Diaz, I'm sure that there are many other musicians that are in this in-between space of not being represented by the binary representations that we're so used to in our modern narratives.
Just on that same point of other musicians who exist in this space, I remember attending a folklore class by Jose Francisco Barroso. Anybody remember him?
Yeah.
And so this is when he got a grant to do a free class at the Redwood Heights Center up there. And after the class, sometimes a certain rumbero by the name of Fito Reynoso, Fito would show up to the place and turn it out every time. People get excited. People are like, oh, I want to go home with Fito. Ah, here comes Fito. And I remember asking, I can't remember if it was, but my son wasn't born yet. It was another kid. Someone asked him, like, where do you think that guy is from? The kid said he thought he was from Richmond. Like on some Bay Area, That's how Fito energy comes, He thought Fito was from Richmond. Come on. So this kind of interchange, this like roots level, cellular, exchange has been happening, and that's 20 some odd years from now, since, into the past. Having read the book and getting to know you better now, a big curiosity emerged from me, Eva. You mentioned that you became a diplomat, right? And so I want to ask, how was it that you became a diplomat, and what was that like, thinking about your positionality in terms of a non-traditional Cuban mindset, a kind of in-between space? What was it like to be tapped as the Cuban diplomat in that kind of context, musically and otherwise?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I studied music in Cuba, in the Manuel Saumel Conservatory, and then I studied then international relations as a career, because it was my only way to travel the world. I didn't have any family abroad, so in the moment that I was studying, for Cubans it was not possible to travel anywhere in the world. So for me, the career of a diplomat was a way to explore the world, to get to know the world. I was in that space. I started working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I was lucky enough that I was a position in the Department of International Organizations. So I started traveling to New York to attend meetings of the Administrative and Budgetary Committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and I became an international negotiator there. I was traveling between Havana and New York since '96 to 2003. At the time, I was kind of like separated from music a little bit, even though I have so many Cuban friends, musicians living in New York. So it's crazy, and I write about this in the novel that I'm writing, because visiting Cubans that live in New York was illegal for me as a diplomat. It was not possible. So, why? Because when you are a diplomat, you belong to them. You don't have a life. Everything is controlling your life. You just go to United Nations, do your thing there as an international negotiator, but that's it. I couldn't visit Cuban friends. I couldn't do anything, you know, it was prohibited for me.
Okay.
Because it was a way to control. They have always been about control, absolute control. So,
Are you saying, Eva, that that's a particularly Cuban thing or just in general?
the Cuban government. No.
Okay.
All the no, my God. I was always interacting, thank God, with other diplomats from all over the world. My committee was comprised of 200 people because, you know, every country was represented there. Thank God that I was able to interact with all these people because they saved my life. Because I've always been very in between. I've never felt represented anywhere. So that was my way, you know, I interacted with people from all over the world to feel a place of belonging. So at that time, I would go to to clubs in New York to see my friends. I also went to recordings. Like for example, I would go to see Giovanni Terry, Daphne Prieto. They were starting in New York in the 90s, creating, you know, scenes of jazz. And that was totally illegal for me. If I would call just visiting my friends, I would have had trouble. Afterwards, they realized that Daphne Prieto was becoming very famous. And then they were like, oh, why didn't you invite him? So they allowed me to invite him to my house because it was inside the embassy. That was one example. And also I went to the recordings of Art Bembe with Hemay Pavel, December Bueno, and many other musicians, also on my own risk, because that act of connecting with my people was totally, you know, it was impossible, right, for my condition as a diplomat. So my condition as a diplomat allowed me to be in New York, and I realized that there was a strong jazz Cuban scene in New York ongoing, happening, that people were not talking about in books or in any research, but I saw that it was strong and it was vibrant. So when I migrated to Miami, I defected, you know, because my family was in Mexico and they started pressuring my family to come back to Cuba because they wanted to send someone else to replace my father, who was a doctor, arbitrarily. So my family took the decision to migrate, to defect, and I escaped from the embassy in New York to Mexico with the idea of establishing there, but I couldn't. After 3 months, I decided that I wanted to go back to the US because I missed the US. I was kind of used to it in a way, and I wanted to give my son the American passport too, because I find that it was, you know, it gives him some facilities, right? Some privilege. So when I was in New York, as I say, I realized that there was a strong Cuban jazz scene there, but then I migrated to Miami, and I realized that in Miami it was weird because everything Cuban was back to the 50s, especially in the 2000s. But then I started, because my husband, you know, my father's son at the time, he was a musician, so we started, you know, visiting places, and I realized that there were a lot of Cuban musicians doing many different things, that they were creating Cuban music in all realms, but that was not still recognized in the literature, and it was not, people didn't pay attention that much because the music industry in Miami is very, as you know, commercial, so they cater more towards the commercial music made by musicians. So Cubans that came from the island that had all this important legacy, they didn't want to trade that for the commercial, you know, parameters that were happening in Miami. So they were kind of non-recognized by Cubans in the island or by the music industry in Miami. So they became in this in-between space of non-existence until recently. Things have changed and they are starting to be recognized, especially the jazz players, not so much others, but they are opening spaces with their own legacy. And that's what is fascinating to me, because instead of converting into commercial, like, well, some cases did, like December Bueno, you know, he changed completely to the, coming from an alternative, I would say, music to more Latino, whatever kind of mainstream music. Yeah, pop. But most of these other musicians stick to their legacy, and they are creating spaces in which they navigate more into the Cuban patterns of what Cuban culture is in their own ways, universalized because it has a, you know, world twist, right? But that's what my experience was. Thank you for the question.
I'm going to ask one more question before opening up to, I see people jumping at the bit in the audience. My last question before we open up is about audience. And, you know, with this notion of in between space, Cuba on one hand, Miami, Bay Area, what's your audience? But then also in terms of level of reception, academic, just motherfuckers in the street, Cuban dignitaries, historians, right? And your choices in terms of the language you use to write, Spanish, English, erudite versus easy language. Which are your various audiences, and how did you make choices along the way to try and achieve or reach those different pockets of people?
Yeah, thank you for the question. My original audience, I was really obsessed with Cuban studies, people who study Cuban, because I saw so many gaps when it comes to the way, or instead of gaps, let's put it this way, I saw traditional ways of looking at Cuba, or studying Cuba, right? That came from the Cold War times or from mainstream music market. So more visible music was always studied. But I was like, but what about all this other music that is incredible, that is not that visible? Why people don't study that? So for me, that was
What are the examples of that unstudied music?
Like Cuban jazz, okay, for example, or singer-songwriters after Nueva Trova.
Okay.
Because, you know, this third generation of Nueva Trova musicians, right, which they're not Nueva Trova, they are called, I call it Global Nueva Trova, but yeah, you can call it whatever you want. It's the third generation of musicians who have a strong influence from Nueva Trova, Silvio Rodriguez and Pablo, but they are also opening up these Nueva Trova patterns. Alex Cuba, that's
okay.
another example. Yusa, I think too. There are many. No other name come to mind, but yeah, there are many. Well, Temari, you know, it's another example. Vanito Brown, Habana Abierta, you know. There are examples of singer-songwriters who are revolutionizing the legacy of the Nueva Trova with new sonorities, with experiences that they are having as migrants in the world, throughout the world. Audience, that was my main audience. So I'm curious to know who else is interested in my book. I've primarily talked to Cuban studies and ethnomusicologists, but I think this book could be interesting to anybody who is interested in world music, Cuban culture, you know, the African diaspora, because in a way, even though all Cubans are non-white, we are all in awe, and we are all revolutionizing, I think, or updating the legacy of the African diaspora through our different manifestations, right? And that's something that I think some people are more aware than others, but that is going on. And I think it's important to recognize that we all are revolutionizing or adopting, updating the legacy of the African diaspora in different ways. Either in hip hop, timba, you know, jazz, singing, songwriting. So that's another important audience for me. And I really don't know much more because, you know, this is kind of new. So I hope this book interests other people as well. I'm very curious to know who else might be interested.
Maybe one day we do something together.
Yes. Yes. We are doing something together. We will continue for sure. Thank you so much.
Let's have some questions from the audience.
Yes. We have a microphone, please. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I was about to ask you about something about this like last question, because what I feel is like your book is called like Cuban fusion, but I'm pretty sure like this is an Afro-Cuban fusion book, because I feel like there's not Cuban music, there's like Afro-Cuban music, and we have to recognize that like black music and black musicians are like the more important like music and musicians from the island, because there's like not like a lot we can say like about like white Europeans like Cuban music at all. The more important like European like let's say like aporte, how can I say like
contribution
to like Cuban music is like flamenco music, which is not like even white or white European. So I feel like it's very important to have this book in our hands because it's like an Afro-Cuban music fusion book. And I just want to say like thank you, and like I'm very like grateful for you all like Afro-Cuban like musicians and like scholars and like magic, because that's everything in Cuba and like in the Cuban diaspora. Thank you so much, Dr. and blessings.
Thank you so much. I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you.
Has everybody followed Eva Silot Bravo on Instagram or different platforms?
Thank you so much, brother. We're gonna work together, for sure.
But why didn't you call it Afro-Cuban, to piggyback off of that question?
Because, well, she wanted to ask a question. I'm learning to be Afro-Cuban, all right? Because as a mulata, I didn't have spaces while I was living in Cuba to explore my Afro-Cubanness, my African legacy, because I was a passing, Cuban. I was always operating in white or mostly white spaces. So I'm learning to be Afro-Cuban outside the island. So when I refer to Cuba, I realized that, as she said, most of, as they say, most of our culture owes to Africa. But that's a conclusion that I'm learning and gaining the knowledge outside my country. So, absolutely, I agree. When we say Cuban, we're really basically saying Afro-Cuban. But, yeah, that's it. I totally agree.
Because the brainwash and the colonialism.
Yeah.
So you're saying that, like, while you were conceiving this stuff, you would be thinking about yourself as just a mixed person and not necessarily as a Cuban like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the end, I realized that, and even I get kind of angry with myself because I'm like, this book should be, or there has to be a book. And I'm obsessed with Afro-descendant female and non-binary voices. That's what I think is missing. That is the next step, Because in our culture, we don't acknowledge, I think, enough Afro-descendant female and non-binary subjects because the patriarchy that we exist in our culture inside and outside the island. So I think as I'm unpacking my culture and discovering all these layers of important voices and cultural production that we don't, talk a lot or we don't research enough, that are so key, to talk about our culture. And we always do, we always recognize Fernando Ortiz, Lydia Cabrera, because we recognize the anthropologists white anthropologists have been discovering our culture from the white gaze. But we don't do enough to recognize the Afro-Cuban knowledge producers. And that's what I'm kind of obsessed about. Who are they? What do we have to say that is different to what has been said?
So, for example, Carlos Aldama, in my work with him in my book, Carlos Aldama's Life in Bata, Cuba, Diaspora and the Journey, he talks about the original, singers of Anya and Bata were black women. And he recognizes other authors like Nicolás Angarica affirming that before, it was men who were expected to be singing Anya, it was women back in the day. And in the next book, Theme of Music, Black Rebel Dance, Renegade Stance, Theme of Music and Black Identity in Cuba, it also talks there about the contributions of women to popular music like Freddie, the bolerista, otras rumberas como Mercedes Mendoza, ¿no? And others. Celeste Mendoza,
Mercedita Valdés,
otras rumberas como voces principales.
La Lupe, for example.
La Lupe.
Hey, we don't know enough about La Lupe because we have kind of put her aside because all these stories about her, but I don't care who she was. I care her music legacy. and we have to study way more because it has been studied by others, but we Cubans don't pay enough attention to that because we're used to always recognize, white men as the knowledge producers, as the ones who have to be valued in our culture. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
My name is Leticia. Thank you for being here. So you mentioned during your talk that classical music was accepted and encouraged. And it sounded like it was a contrast to pop music, right?
Cuban popular music.
I was curious about Afro-Cuban folklore, if that's encouraged. Is that accepted and encouraged in the island?
Now, yes, but when I studied music, it was prohibited. All right? Only if Leo Brouwer, for example, who is a figure who produced Cuban music with a classical, background, if he would happen to incorporate Afro-Cuban music, that was applauded. That way. But it's the way we have renegade Afro-Cuban legacy, and we have incorporated that through the lens of other people or through the lens of the classical canon. That was when it was celebrated. Of course, this has changed, and you can see now that people are studying Cuban popular music and Afro-Cuban music in the school systems. But when this is in the 80s, in the 80s it was prohibited. It was interesting because we were kids. We were just, playing with tumbao. We were so eager to learn tumbao in piano. And we have this tia, running around, and she opened the door like, "What are you doing? Cuban music? Come on." And it's so funny because we were Cubans, come on. And we were only allowed to talk about Beethoven, Mozart. That was all totally encouraged. But at the time, anything Afro-Cuban. And that's the problem. We are so elitist. Our culture is so elitist. And this is the post-colonial legacy, that we don't know what to do with our Afro-Cuban legacy, all right? Except for tourists. When it comes to tourists, we prepare a show, we put it together. Ooh, this is Cuba. But it's a very touristic appeal. But we don't really embrace it, I think, organically. And it's there. It's not gonna go anywhere. You know what I mean?
But I think that, I think that the resistance of these musicians is all about that. I was talking to Yumi. I don't know if it's like this, way to resist in the music schools where we were forced to play just like European music, but then the jazz and this fusion, it was the only way. It was the only way for popular musicians and black musicians in the school to resist and bring the black legacy and the black music and the popular music to the school through jazz.
Absolutely.
And that's amazing that you just collect these all names and music of these people, because they were resisting inside the racist education Cuban system through jazz and through other other ways, because we were not allowed to play Afro-Cuban music in school, but we were allowed to play Afro jazz or jazz from the north, and then we were using that to mix, and that's why Latin jazz is born in the school, because it was the only way we had to embrace the black music on school.
And let's not forget, jazz was prohibited. There you go.
Something is coming to me right now. Just the other day, we lost the great Afro-Cuban author Tomás Fernández Robaina. He always had the phrase, "Siempre más cimarrón," right? Always more maroon, or always more revolutionary. And so I just want to recognize if you're writing in that tradition of bucking the system, right? So let's have a moment of silence or a round of applause or something for Tomasito and for this book that you've done that's in the tradition that he never wanted, Moment of silence for Tomasito.
Thank you.
And so we have another author in the building too. We have
Yes,
Rebecca
Rebecca.
Whitehammer in the building. I wonder if you have some question or some instigation to the conversation.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. And of course, I can't help remember that 9 years ago, Umi and I were on the same stage, and you were doing the same thing when my book came out. So let's like recognize the, you know, the long like history of scholarship on Cuban music that you produced. You know? Yes. So okay, so the one thing that I guess I started thinking about when you were talking about the different musicians you're covering is just the ways that the different diasporic sites and cities and areas are somehow like each has their own distinct like musical identity. So of course I'm from here. Like I did my doctorate here. Like I used to come, you know, for the rumbas here. It was always interesting to me. You know, I studied with Jesus for many years. It was always interesting to me that despite a very small Cuban population here, there were like a disproportionate number of like folkloric and you know, popular music and black musicians that moved here. Musicians and dancers, because there are, you know, a lot of dancers too, like Barroso and you know, many other people. So, you know, there was and then there were even like in the 80s, there were groups like Céspedes, right? So they were, you know, producing, even before the timba wave, like they were producing like these son groups that, you know, were wonderful. And so, you know, Bobby Céspedes, amazing. She's really amazing. So, you know, that's the Bay Area. And then like, I haven't spent as much time in Miami, but from everything that I've been told, I actually have attended rumba events there, but I also know that rumba is like so much more invisible there in a way, because the population is so large and because like so many of the Cubans there like are not interested in rumba and folklore, and yet there's like millions of tambores being played like all the time, right? Because of all, you know, everyone who has santo there. So it's like there's that stuff going on there. You know, there's, I think in Miami also, from what I understand, like there was a certain level of gatekeeping, you know, particularly by the Estefans who were so powerful in the Latin music industry, and it was like, okay, if they like blessed you with, if they gave you their blessing, right, then you would, you know, you would get somewhere. But there was, I think, a lot more like political maneuvering in Miami, but you've lived there, so you could speak more to that.
Yeah.
You know, and then like lastly, I just think of Madrid, and then how like there were so many singer-songwriter, you know, trovadores who went there. So anyway, yeah, like what about these different scenes in different places?
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring that up. Yes, there's an identity of scenes. In Miami, I would call it more eclectic because of the composition is so varied. So you will have a singer-songwriting scenes because a lot of singer-songwriters who were based in Madrid migrated to Miami later on. And also you have timba, a lot of timba bands. And you have a lot of, you have jazz, fusionized with timba, you know, in different, but yes, rumberos. The problem in Miami is too wide. So that implies that rumba and everything else African related is secondary. It's not recognized in the culture that much. It is presented, but there's no curatorial work. And that was my fight in Miami the whole time. I told them, we have to recognize in Miami is a Caribbean city. There's no conversation about that in Miami, about how Caribbean Miami is. And we don't have connections with Afro-Americans in Miami to start with. Therefore, we are missing that link of, you know, the Afro-diasporic culture because the ways we are, right? So I think that's important and that is missing. So I would call Miami scene eclectic because of this diversity. I would call New York, there's an important jazz scene, but also there are singer-songwriters there that have been doing their thing for a while. Peru, timba.
And El Reparto.
Reparto. There
yeah.
you go.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. The West Coast, I don't know enough, but I know it's an eclectic one. I know a lot of Afro-Cubans are here, so it's interesting to me. But I would say it's an eclectic one, right? Because you have a lot of Afro-Cuban legacy, but you also have a lot of jazz players, you know, that are, I would say, more in LA, in the South. And then you have, I don't know, many other cities. We have Paris, we have Italy, we have Canada, many cities in Canada. We have in Mexico, come on. There are many cities in which Cubans have created their own.
Cali, Colombia.
Cali, Colombia. So so in a way, this book is a provocation for researchers to study Cuban legacy, Cuban culture all over the world, because it's happening and we don't need to wait for these people to die again to start studying them. We have to recognize them while they are alive, because it's difficult enough to be a migrant, you know, to just be totally non-visible when you have so much to say culturally speaking. Thank you for the question. Anybody else?
Go buy that book. Go buy that book.
Thank you so much. Oh, yes.
Do you have a compendium of the videos that are associated, like that are referenced in your?
No, but I have a playlist that you can, you know, how do you say that word? Scan. You can scan and you can enjoy the playlist that is associated with the book.
The playlist is also in the
Oh, it's in the back?
It's in the book. It's in the back of the book, but here you can have it, you know, musically, so you can listen to it while you're home. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.